Today we're going to do the second part in my series on ancient Egypt. If you missed the first one, it was a look at Napoleon's invasion of Egypt from 1799 to 1801 and how that led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and ultimately the founding of modern Egyptology. Today we're looking at 3 ancient Egyptian myths and what those myths can tell us about the way ancient Egyptians thought about the world. The stories that a culture tells really can tell us quite a bit about what they thought, how they felt about certain things, how they saw themselves, and what their priorities were. And for the record, I am painting with a very broad brush here. No culture that has survived for 3,000 years can be distilled down into 3 myths. The myths I will be covering today are first the Egyptian creation story, which has 2 separate versions. We will be looking at them both. Second, we're going to look at the tale of Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Seth, and then Pharaoh, Zoser, and Khnemu the Nile. In a way, I'm going to be kind of fitting 5 myths into 3, but I think that the way I've structured it will make sense as we go. Before we get into myth telling, first an introduction. What can we really know about ancient Egypt? The Rosetta Stone gives us the ability to read their ancient writings, and that ability heavily was expanded from its decipherment in 1822 through the 1830s, where a real thorough understanding of hieroglyphs developed. Excavation started in earnest in about the 1830s, and there were mixed methodologies. Some, like Flanders Petrie, you're gonna find really excellent methodologies, though he did not treat his workers well. And then you're gonna have more of an adventure excavator type, and that didn't go quite as well for the artifacts. But what we have is really expanded our understanding of Egyptian history through the pyramid texts, for paintings on tombs, through papyruses, which are a little bit more fragile than we might have hoped, and various religious texts found inside sarcophaguses, on walls, or as papyrus within a tomb. Egyptians wrote both fiction and poetry, which really gives us a lot of insight to their inner workings and the things that they cared about. The study of Egyptology is ultimately giving us a very fragmented view of the Egyptian past. It is conditional upon what has survived to us and biased towards stone-built temples and tombs. The temples and tombs that were built with stone were meant to last forever, whereas the mud brick palaces or homes were rather meant to fade away within a generation or 2. What has survived to us also leans heavily towards the New Kingdom, and that evidence should not be extrapolated over 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian culture and life, which is somewhat what I'm about to do in this video, so apologies. Like I said before, we're painting with a broad brush here. But also to complicate that is the site of excavations that have been able to be done. A good place to inhabit in antiquity tends to still be a good place to inhabit today. So that means that sites that archaeologists would really be interested in studying also happen to be sites where people now live. Not every source we have is particularly reliable either. So old kings lists tend to completely neglect certain pharaohs. Tutankhamun and anyone from the Amarna period, they're pretty much off. No one includes them. And then Hatshepsut, because she is a female, is often left off. Even the temples of these pharaohs were no longer given credit. So Seti and Ramses the Great both took credit for a lot of the temples that were built during the Amarna period, whereas Moses III, who was the successor to Hatshepsut, took her name off pretty much everything she built. Egyptian religion is polytheistic. Gods were worshipped in temples and had a priesthood that organized feast days or celebrations surrounding that god. Religion permeated most aspects of ancient Egyptian life, somewhat expected considering that they viewed their head of state as a god. While the common people did revere the pharaoh and Ra as state gods, that didn't mean that the people's private worship was centrally focused on those gods. There was often a personal god that perhaps something to do with their vocation or something that they specifically associated with. And often in ancient times, and this is pretty much throughout the Near East, there would be a personal god that maybe would be set up in a shrine in a person's home. There would be regional gods that would be more aligned with a specific city. And then there might be a national god or a state level god who would be the big kahuna for everybody that they were supposed to be worshiping. But that still meant that if you had a more personal relationship with a specific god, you would turn to them and your prayers to them in a time of personal struggle. Because Egypt has so many gods, they didn't really have any difficulty with the idea of incorporating new gods from other places. So Greek gods get mingled in, Baal from the Canaanites gets mingled in. And when apostles come after the death of Jesus into Egypt, it's actually not that difficult to get the Egyptians to accept a trinity because they already have lots of trinities in their state religion anyways. So all that to say, there are lots of gods to cover here that I am not going to be saying anything about. That doesn't mean they're not interesting. That doesn't mean their myths are not interesting. It just means that for the purposes of this video, I'm covering probably some of the more major gods and their stories. Most gods were depicted as anthropomorphically or zoomorphically, meaning that they had a human shape, but then also they had some sort of animal association. Animals seem to be endowed with some sort of mythical property, and the gods would be able to protect people against whatever animal it was that they represented. So for an example, Anubis, who is a jackal or some kind of like super canine, he was heavily involved in the process of mummification and being sure that a dead body was going to safely get to burial. If you're worried about jackals coming and eating a dead body, then having Anubis, who is shaped like a jackal, be the god of the protection of the dead, that makes a lot of sense because Anubis can hopefully ward off and command all those jackals to leave your body alone. All that to say, let's get started with our first myth. We're going to be looking at two versions of the Egyptian creation myth. Our first myth comes from Hermopolis, and it covers the 8 primordial gods, or the Ogdad. The original 8 gods are Hak and Haket, representing formlessness, Kuk and Kuket, representing darkness, Amun and Amunet, representing hiddenness, and Nun and Nunet, who were the waters. Together, they represented chaos. A hill rose out of the water, and the god Atum stood on the hill. He created himself independently, and his name means complete. Atum created the other gods through his semen or saliva, you pick. He was the father of Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture. And Shu and Tefnut begat Geb, earth, and Nut, sky. Egypt is unique in that their sky deity is a female and their earth deity is male. Geb and Nut gave birth to Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys. In contrast to this creation myth comes the creation myth found in the pyramid texts of Zoser. Zoser was the first pharaoh to be buried in a pyramid. So before creation, Ra, the shining sun, rose out of the waters. The secret of Ra's power lay in his name, which was hidden from the world. Ra could name a thing, and it would come into being. Ra named all the earth and everything in it, and thus all the earth came to be. Ra took the shape of a man and became the first pharaoh of Egypt. For thousands of years he reigned over the land, and it was a golden age. At last, however, Ra grew old, for he had become a man to rule over Egypt. And because he could no longer rule over Egypt well, evil entered into the hearts of man. Ra spoke the name Sekhmet into being, and the lioness goddess was born. Ra tasked her with destroying man, and the Nile was soon filled with the blood of her hunts. Man repented of his evil deed, and Ra wished to spare those who were left, but Sekhmet could not be called back. So Ra told the priests to gather the red ochre that grew on Elephantine Island and mix it with beer. When Sekhmet slept, the priests poured the red beer around her lair, and when she awoke, the area was flooded with red liquid that she took to be blood, and she began to drink it, and soon became drunk. Ra called her back and declared that peace should be with her, and Sekhmet became a goddess of healing. The problem of Ra persisted. He was too old to continue on as pharaoh. He was given a prophecy that the goddess Nut would bear a son who would become king of Egypt after Ra. Ra cursed Nut so that she would not be able to bear children. And that's where we will pause the myth and go over what it shows us about the Egyptians, and then we'll pick up with the goddess Nut and what she does to conceive her children. Throughout the Old Kingdom, Egypt's chief god was Ra. In the Middle Kingdom, Ra was synchronized with Amun, becoming Amun-Ra. This was the dominant deity throughout ancient Egypt. Ra, as the sun god, was also the creator god, who ensured that the sun completed its cycle every day. The goddess Hathor was the one who was responsible for bringing things into life after Ra had already created them, so perpetuating the cycle of birth. The methodology of creation does vary between these two myths, but they have some similarities. There's a chaos or primordial water from which life begins. In some versions, Atum or Ra is inside an egg that has to hatch. The Agdad shows what characteristics are considered chaotic to the Egyptians. So we have darkness, formlessness, hiddenness, or the wind, and water. And in the Agdad, there's a female complement to each male deity, and that's represented by the et at the end of her name, like, Chipetz. It's the same thing in Egyptian naming conventions. If there's an et, it's a girl. What I find especially interesting is that the characteristics found in this creation myth can also be found in the Genesis account of creation, where Yahweh is hovering over the chaos waters. And also like Genesis, in our myth from Heliopolis, Ra creates everything in existence through the spoken word. Ra speaks the world into existence. And if we're going to go with Moses as the historic author of Genesis, this makes perfect sense. In the Bible's own accounting of Moses, he is an Egyptian prince, or is raised as an Egyptian prince, and would be very familiar with these creation stories. The world was under a golden age with Ra, until he gets too old to rule. Then evil enters into the heart of man. This echoes a common problem with Egypt, such as with Pepi II, who had the longest recorded rule of any monarch. A pharaoh who is too old cannot perform his duties properly. The role of kingship requires a vigorous man who can lead his army into battle, perform temple duties, and keep law and order in Egypt. In Pepi II's case, this led to the first intermediate period of Egypt's history, where the Old Kingdom came to a close. Though I also should mention that Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom are all constructs. They're from a king's list that was created during the time of Ptolemy II. So Egyptologists still refer to them this way, but it's kind of a, it's not a hard thing that Egyptians would have used during ancient Egyptian history. They wouldn't have said, oh, we're living in the New Kingdom now. No. And what the intermediate periods were these periods in between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And they were times of what would be considered troubles, but also just simply times where the centralized state of Egypt no longer was functioning. Ra's attempt to deal with evil when it comes into the world is to kill everyone. But that doesn't really work that well. So there was bloodshed and a time of trouble for man because Ra was unable to deal with the evil that was with man. And he is unable to simply recall the goddess Sekhmet when the bloodshed has run its course. And when Ra hears that his replacement is on the way, he refuses to accept it. The Egyptians seem to have protected their son's rules by making them co-rulers within their lifetimes. Acceptance of eventual death and preparing the prince to take the place of the pharaoh is properly performing the duties of kingship and ensuring the line of succession properly so that disorder does not come to Egypt. In that way, Ra, who has become too weak to properly perform his functions, is failing as a pharaoh, which leads us to our next myth, which is going to be involving Osiris, Isis, Seth, Horus. The goddess Nut of the sky had been cursed that she would be unable to have children because her son is the prophesied replacement of Ra. She begs Thoth, the god of wisdom and of the moon, to help her find a solution to her problem. Thoth goes and plays a drinking game with Khonsu, another moon deity. And within that game, the moon gambles away 5 days of moonlight, which is able to extend the calendar from 360 days to 365 days, and explains why the moon is not always full since it doesn't have all of its moonlight anymore. Using the extra 5 days, Nut is able to have her 5 children: Osiris, Harmachis, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys. Thoth instructs Osiris and Isis in magic, and Isis is even instructed by Khonsu and learns the mysteries of the moon. Isis grows into a great magician. Osiris and Isis marry, and so do Seth and Nephthys. Ra continues to grow older and older. His head shakes with palsy, and he dribbles saliva everywhere he goes. Isis wants to find a way to make Ra give up his throne. It concludes the only way to do so is by learning his secret name. Isis follows Ra one day through his walk through the sky, and Ra dribbles saliva on the ground as he goes. Isis collects the mud that the saliva forms and forms with it a cobra. It is the first creature to enter the world not through Ra speaking its name. Isis leaves the cobra in wait, and the next day, as Ra comes by, the cobra strikes his heel. Ra does not have a way to heal the poison and does not know the name of the creature. Ra calls the gods together to see if anyone can heal him, but they can't. Isis finally comes forward humbly to Ra and claims that she can heal him if she knows his true name, for she knew many spells. Ra tries to avoid telling her, but the names he shares are not his true name, and finally he tells her while making her swear that only Horus, her son, will know his true name, which has something to do with Amun, or hiddenness, and that is how Ra came to be known as Amun-Ra. Once Isis knows his secret name, she's able to heal Ra, and his human form now has to return to the ship in the sky. It allows Osiris to take up his position as pharaoh of Egypt, and Isis is his queen. We'll pause there now. For a quick note on names. Isis knows true names. It's kind of her thing. As her myth goes on, Isis knows the true name of everything. To know the true name of something is to have power over it. So think of like an Irish Celtic situation with the fairies and the fae. That's the big thing, right? Don't tell a fairy your name, they'll have power over you. Pharaohs have a lot of names, and each one has to do with facets of their rule, or it has to do with their connection to the gods. But their true name, any Egyptian's true name, would be something that's just known by your mother. And the superstition of the Egyptians was that if anyone knew your true name and wished you ill, they would be able to curse you and cause all sorts of troubles in your life. So it was a vital secret. Back to the myth. Osiris and Isis begin civilization, and they teach Egyptians how to grow wheat and barley, to grow fruit, and how to make wine. The pillars of civilization, these things. And after they finish teaching all the Egyptians, Osiris leaves Isis in charge and goes off to teach the rest of the world. Now Seth has been jealous of Osiris this entire time, and he wants to be the pharaoh of Egypt, but he doesn't think he can take the throne while Isis holds it. She's too powerful. So he hatches a plan to trap and kill his brother Osiris when he returns from abroad. Seth holds a great feast, and he brings out a chest, and it's a magnificent chest. And he challenges everyone to try and fit inside the chest, and whoever fits the most perfectly will win it. Everyone at the feast tries, but some people are too thin, some people are too fat, some are too tall, some are too short. And eventually Osiris decides to attempt it, and it fits him perfectly because Seth had taken Osiris's measurements and made the chest to fit Osiris perfectly. And then Seth slams the chest closed, he seals it with molten lead, and then he throws it into the Nile. And because the inundation is currently happening, the Nile's really high, it sweeps the chest out into the Mediterranean Sea. Isis hears about Seth's treachery, and she sets out to look for her husband's body because his remains have to return to Egypt and be buried on Egyptian soil for him to pass successfully into the land of the dead. The chest went to the city of Byblos in Syria, where it came to rest on a tamarisk tree. The tree grew around the chest, making it completely hidden. The king and queen of Byblos cut down the tree and have it as a pillar in the palace. Isis is able to track Osiris there and then to convince them to open up the pillar, and there's Osiris's body. Isis takes it home, planning to bury her husband, but Seth finds out about it again, and he steals Osiris's body, cuts it into 14 pieces, and scatters it throughout Egypt. Isis has to retrieve each piece, but she is unable to retrieve his phallus, which has been consumed by fish. With the help of Nephthys and Anubis, the son of Seth and Nephthys, Isis is able to construct a new phallus and make Osiris complete again for burial. To trick Seth, they claim to bury Osiris in 14 different locations, and Osiris's spirit is able to enter into the land of the dead, where he is now its king. At some point, and this may have been before Osiris died, or after he died, or after Isis fashioned his phallus, there are lots of different ways the story goes, Isis becomes pregnant with Horus. And as we will get to, Horus then battles Seth, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's unpack all the stuff with Osiris and Isis and his death. Osiris and Isis are credited with the start of civilization, so that's growing wheat and growing barley and making wine. Osiris then went out to teach all the other civilizations about how to do this. That Egypt really views itself as the one who came up with agriculture and also as one of the first real civilized civilizations. Ultimately, what this myth gives an explanation to is the funerary cult of ancient Egypt. So So it's promised that Osiris is eventually going to resurrect. So what did Osiris do? These are the things that other Egyptians need to also do if they are also seeking to eventually resurrect. When Osiris comes back from the land of the dead and beats Seth and the chaos forces once and for all. He had a box shaped exactly like his body. Wow, that sounds like a sarcophagus, doesn't it? And then Isis has to make sure that her husband is buried on Egyptian soil. So if you've ever wondered, or if you've ever noticed, Egypt doesn't really set up a lot of colonies. They go in, they beat people militarily, they take their stuff, and then they go home. They don't stay there. And that's because all Egyptians believed they needed to be buried on Egyptian soil for their soul to pass successfully into the next world. So if you've died there, if you've lived your whole life in a foreign place, then your soul may not be going to the land of the dead. And then when Seth desecrates Osiris's body by cutting it into the 14 pieces, you'll notice that Isis very specifically has to craft a new piece so that he is whole. So if you're missing parts, it becomes the job of the embalmer, the undertaker, to fix the missing parts for your mummy so that all of you is there. So if you say you lose a hand in this life, they're gonna craft you a hand to go on your mummy so that in the next life you will have a hand. Finally, we can see the secrecy where Osiris was buried. So his soul has passed successfully to the land of the dead. That part's done, check. But in order for him to successfully resurrect, that means his body still needs to be preserved on this side of the world. And what Seth could do is destroy Osiris's body once again. So it has to be a secret where Osiris is buried. And the pharaohs did this. I mean, you may not think they did this because they have a giant pyramid, but once they realized that the pyramids were getting raided and people were desecrating the mummies, they're like, we've got to put this somewhere else. And so they did the Valley of the Kings, which, they carved out rock tombs, and they were much more hidden, and then they could kind of get rid of the entrances and put the rocks down so that they were completely covered. And then nobody knew where the pharaoh was buried. I mean, the tomb raiders knew because they were probably the craftsmen who worked on the tomb to begin with, but nah. And another thing that the pharaohs would sometimes do is have two separate burials, so that they would do one burial which was in the north and one burial that was in the south, and only one of them was the true burial where the body was. I mean, both probably got raided. All right, back to Horus. However he came to be, Horus is a baby when his father dies. And Seth tries to take control of Egypt, eliminate Horus by turning into a scorpion and stinging him, and then Horus dies, but don't worry, he comes back to life, and then discrediting Horus's claim in front of the other gods. And Isis is not allowed to come to this council of the gods. So she disguises herself as Seth's wife, Nephthys, who left Seth when he started being evil to Osiris. And she decides to play a trick on Seth. So Seth sees that Nephthys is still very beautiful. He wants her to be the queen. And Nephthys, or Isis, as she really is, who is disguised as Nephthys, says, okay, you have to swear an oath that my son is going to be the pharaoh of Egypt and that you're not going to do anything to hurt him unless he raises an army or something to attack you. Otherwise, you've got to leave him alone and you've got to let him to be pharaoh when it's his time to be pharaoh. And Seth, who's thinking that she's talking about their son, Anubis, is like, sure, why not? I'm good to swear on that. And then Isis drops the disguise and she's like, haha, you see, you swore now that you have to let Horus be pharaoh. And Seth says, curses, and he goes off into the desert because he's a chaos god. And deserts are also a location of chaos, just like the primordial waters in the creation myth. Isis rules Egypt in lieu of her son Horus until he is a man grown. And then once he is grown, it's time to do battle with his uncle. So Horus loses an eye, but then it gets magically regenerated, and Seth doesn't die, but he escapes, and Horus is ultimately crowned the pharaoh of Egypt. And he lives as the pharaoh for several hundred years, but then it's time for him, because he's getting old, to give up his physical form and then go join Ra in the boat in the sky, helping the sun go from east to west every day. While he was the pharaoh, it was another golden age, and then his spirit is going to inhabit every pharaoh that comes after him. So every pharaoh is Horus, or the spirit of Horus lives inside every pharaoh. And the purpose of that is so that the living pharaoh has the ability to fight against the forces of chaos that come from deities. You can't just have a regular man as the king. He wouldn't stand a chance against Seth. But because the pharaoh has the spirit of Horus, he is able to to keep the peace and order of Egypt. And then one day, Osiris and Horus are going to return, and they are going to do battle with the forces of chaos and evil, and all men not found worthy of eternal life and who haven't had their bodies properly preserved as mummies are just gonna have their souls eaten by the crocodile Amut. And that is the end of the myth of Osiris and Isis and Seth and Horus. And here's what all that last bit meant to the Egyptians. Seth doesn't die. Evil will always be with us. Chaos will always be with us until the end of time, or whatever kind of this utopian final days is that Osiris and Horus are going to bring. Evil and chaos will be with us until then. So all one can do is battle against evil in this life and live according to the concept of Mat, which is that you need your heart to be as light as a feather. And if your heart is not as light as a feather, the crocodile goddess is going to eat it. So one purpose of the pharaoh is to maintain order in Egypt, and then to keep the forces of chaos at bay. And since only a god can do battle with Seth, the pharaoh has to be a god. And he is the physical link between the Egyptian gods and the common people. And he also has to carry out kind of all those daily rituals at the temple and ensure the order of the physical realm. Which brings us to our final myth, which is Khnemu and the Nile, through which one can explore the geographical significance of ancient Egypt and the importance of the Nile, and also the importance of temple worship in Egypt. So in the time of Zoser, the builder of the first step pyramid, the Nile did not rise as it should. For 1 year, this was acceptable. The pharaoh had been wise and saved extra grain, and the people of Egypt did not suffer. But the next year, the Nile did not rise either, and the year after that. In total, there were 7 lean years. And by the 7th, there was starvation everywhere. Zoser was in despair, and though a god, he could do nothing to make the Nile rise. He called for Imhotep, his chief architect, to attend him and commissioned him to find out why the Nile was not rising. Imhotep journeyed up the Nile from Memphis to Thebes, where he prayed to Thoth for wisdom. And Thoth gave him the answer that Zoser thought. The island of Elephantine, where Ra rose from the primordial waters, is far to the south. In a cave on Elephantine is the source of the Nile. The god that dwells there, Khnemu, is perplexed why he has not been honored and worshipped as is his due, for Khnemu is one who guides the Nile and causes it to rise. He leads the Nile over the fields to give life to barley and wheat, but for Khnemu there would be no life in the Nile River Valley. Zoser had neglected the gods. Hearing this, Zoser made ready the royal barge and sailed down to Elephantine, and he decreed that a great temple should be built there in honor of Khnemu. Imhotep, the great architect and builder of the first step pyramid, built this glorious temple, and that year, when it was time for the Nile to rise, a great flood rushed from the caverns on Elephantine, and Egypt was blessed with a great and fertile inundation. Imhotep also cut a rock which fell along the river on the eastern side. A man could mark each year how high the Nile rose. And if the Nile was ever low, the people would know to increase their sacrifices to Khnemu. And that's the myth. So first, let's talk about the geography of the Nile River Valley. Herodotus, one of the first historians of the ancient world, describes Egypt as the gift of the Nile. And the Nile gives us a string that cuts through the Sahara. Without it, no great civilization could exist in Egypt. The Nile rises every year, called the inundation. This brought black soil to the region, which was very fertile and helpful for growing wheat and barley, and it also washed away a lot of the salt. So Egypt is one of the few ancient civilizations that did not have a salinization problem. The Nile took it away. Somewhat ironically, farmers today in Egypt do have a salinization problem because since the Nile has been dammed at Aswan, which prevents the inundation, it means that the Nile does not flood through every year to take away the salt. But because of the dam, lots more of Egyptians can live successfully in Egypt. It prevents droughts from coming to the region. It gives them all their power. Lots more people live population-wise in Egypt now than they did before, but there's still geographic and geological consequences to the dam. Yeah, just a little fun fact. It's not fun. Salinization is never fun. So Egypt can be broken up into 5 distinct things. You have the Nile River Valley, the Delta, the Eastern Desert, and the Western Desert, which also includes the Sinai Peninsula, the Red Sea Mountains, and the Red Sea. So the Nile River flows from higher ground in the south and empties into the Mediterranean in the north. It is one of the very few rivers that flows south to north. The southern part of Egypt is known as Upper Egypt, while North is lower. Within the borders of modern Egypt, the Nile is about 1,000 miles that extends from Aswan up into the Mediterranean Sea. At Aswan, the Nile meets the first cataract, which are granite boulders that cause rapids and make that part of the Nile much more difficult to navigate and sail. The cataract marks Egypt's southern border. Egypt views itself based on the Nile's direction, so their origins are from the south at Elephantine Island, which is near the first cataract, and theologically the Nile symbolizes rebirth and recreation. The Nile River Valley is rarely wider than 5 kilometers, and the whole area is around 10,000 square miles, so not very big when you're thinking about an ancient civilization. The delta is currently the most heavily populated part of Egypt, but that was not the case in the past because of the inundation of the Nile. That region flooded very regularly and it was very difficult to build permanent civilizations there. The Western Desert is part of the African Sahara. It has 6 oases, but is mostly an enormous and inhospitable tract of land. While the oases were inhabited during pharaonic times, they were administrated by the Egyptian state. They mostly served as outposts, and the desert protected Egypt from invaders. The Eastern Desert, which includes Sinai and the actual Eastern Desert and then the Red Sea and the Red Sea Mountains. Sinai was the most difficult region for Egypt to defend and was a common location for conflict. It's important for its mineral wealth. And then the mountains near the Red Sea also acted as a natural barrier, but then they also had long valleys or wadis that could be used as trade routes. They could get goods from cities in Egypt over to ports at the Red Sea. Overall, Egypt is a crossroad between Africa and Asia, but it was also naturally isolated by its geography. To the south, the cataracts; to the west, the Sahara Desert; to the north, the Mediterranean Sea; and then to the east, you have the Eastern Desert and the Red Sea. All this to say, the Nile was the single most important thing for life in Egypt. It was life itself. And what this myth of Osiris contends is that if the gods are upset because they are not receiving proper worship, then they may punish the Egyptians by not allowing the Nile to flow properly. It is the pharaoh's job to ensure that this does not happen by performing proper worship in temples. When you look at the architecture of ancient Egypt, especially stone pyramids and stone temples, these took extraordinary manpower to build. But every year there was a time when people had time to build, and that was during the inundation. You can't do any farming when your farmland is underwater. So from about June to September every year, there was a huge portion of the population that could be rallied towards building. And in the Old Kingdom, this is especially when these big building projects happened. So if you look at the pyramids, those are all, for the most part, Old Kingdom builds. And why would people do all of this building? It's because in the Old Kingdom, no other point in Egyptian history was the pharaoh more considered to be an actual god. And in the same way, at no other point was it more believed that the gods actually would punish the people if their temples were not properly built, if they were not maintained, if there were not functioning priest class to do all of the priestly duties. So what were the responsibilities of the pharaoh or the priests in these temples? Pharaoh is the high priest at every temple technically, but he is not available at every temple every day to do every ritual. And so that's where you have other priests at a temple who are there to fill in the role of the pharaoh. Temples were works of generations, and for example, the Temple of Amun at Karnak, it was the result of over 2,000 years worth of continuous building. These temples were often decorated with images of the king, depicted idealized versions of him, and what was depicted in stone or written in stone was said to be true because words have power. So if you say it or if you speak it, and this is true in those books of the dead that got buried with people and the spells that they had for the afterlife, basically they're just you saying something like Osiris stands with Snefru here and will help him into the afterlife. Because it is said, because it is the spell, it becomes true. Words have a lot of power. So temples were not accessible to everyday people. They were for nobles, they were mostly for priests and the king. The common people needed a priest to pray for them occasionally, or they would have an offering that they would give to the priest to give to the god. General compact between the god and the priests were that the priests would take care of them, so that would include feeding them, and there would be like a statue in the inner sanctum, feeding them, doing their makeup, bathing them, and it kind of sounds like a baby, doesn't it? But sacrificing to them, and then a god would exchange that by blessing Egypt and keeping the Nile rising properly in the inundation and protecting Egypt from its enemies. So in conclusion here, While Egyptian culture existed for some 3,000 years and was the gift of the Nile, it was both culturally cohesive at points and also culturally very dissident at others. Really just depends on what historical period you're in. These myths that I have described to you changed over time. And these myths that I have said may not reflect the spiritual beliefs of every Egyptian at every time over a 3,000 years period. The Egyptians' relationship personally with the gods did get democratized as time went on. So like I said previously, the Old Kingdom was the time when you most fervently believed in the pharaoh as the king who had real, personal, they were the ones who were going to be able to get the gods to bless Egypt. But over time, that got democratized. So initially it was that nobles got pyramid texts or the books of the dead and their sarcophagus. And then as we keep going on, everyone wants a decent tomb or a mini pyramid or something for their burial, because it's not just the pharaoh who is going to resurrect, which was the initial Old Kingdom belief, but everybody who was properly mummified and properly buried was going to be able to resurrect. But specifically the Old Kingdom, whose history we will be covering next time, the pharaoh was a god on earth whose responsibility it was to keep the forces of chaos at bay, to ensure the relationship between the gods and Egyptians were maintained well, and to protect Egypt from invading and hostile forces. Please join me next time as we dig into Old Kingdom Egypt and the pharaohs who built the wonders of the ancient world, those beautiful pyramids, and built a culture that was emulated for 2,000 years after its fall through the Middle and New Kingdoms. Thank you so much for watching this video. Subscribe to my channel and like this video if you would like to see more. Thank you.